The Star Wars sequel trilogy is rather infamous for being the follow-up to perhaps the most famous story in all of cinema that pleased almost nobody, especially because unlike the prequel trilogy, the three movies were so disjointed that even if somebody liked one of them individually, they were likely to still hate the other two because of how different and disconnected from everything else they were. To put it simply, when most call them the sequel trilogy, they're using the term pretty loosely. But the point is, due to a combination of poor writing and the lack of a concrete plan going in, the sequels ended up being a mess, and as a writer myself, I must say, is perhaps one of the worst examples of trying to tell an overarching story out there. But that being said, and as I noted before, in isolation, the three movies do have their good points, with one scene in particular almost feeling like it belongs in a completely different and much better film with how well it's executed. And today, I'd like to go over this scene and argue for why it's probably the best in the whole trilogy. And as always, there will be spoilers for the entire Star Wars saga ahead, so if you're not completely caught up on that, don't proceed with this video. Okay, so while most would suspect that the scene in question would have to come from either The Force Awakens, since it was seemingly the most well-liked, or The Last Jedi, since it was the most creative, surprisingly enough, it's actually from The Rise of Skywalker. Now, please do note here that I am not trying to say that The Rise of Skywalker is actually a good movie, though I did argue that it was better than The Last Jedi in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, just that it contains the best scene in the sequel trilogy. Now obviously everybody will have a different opinion on what exactly constitutes a perfect scene, but for the purposes of this video, I'm referring to the one that has the most emotional depth, payoff, and feeling. And for a movie as infamous as The Rise of Skywalker is for its breakneck pace and barely ever stopping to let the audience catch its breath, one of the few times it does stop makes for perhaps its most effective moment. And that would be the scene where Kylo Ren talks to the memory of Han Solo on the second Death Star. Because on a more superficial level, unlike many other scenes in the sequels that just disregard the lore George Lucas had established in his movies and introduce new powers and concepts willy-nilly, the scene actually acknowledges that non-Force users can't become ghosts and that it isn't the spirit of Han Solo that he's talking to, but is more akin to the memory Kylo Ren and Leia both have of him that's being projected for him to see and interact with. Now, given what goes on in the scene, it would ironically be even more effective if Kylo Ren actually was talking directly to his father's ghost, but one still has to give the movie points for actually trying to respect pre-established lore, particularly because it's one of the only scenes to actually do that. But the biggest reason that it might just be the best scene in the whole trilogy is because it's likely to actually evoke an emotional reaction from the viewer, and the intended one on top of that. Because as I noted before, one of the biggest problems with the sequels is that they don't do a great job at telling their respective stories. So as a result, the only times the audience is really going to care about what's going on is when something happens to a character that they're already emotionally attached to, aka the characters from the previous trilogy, because the narrative doesn't give them any reason to become attached to the new characters. Sure, one could argue that The Force Awakens does do a halfway decent job of making the new characters intriguing, but it starts squandering that in the back half, and The Last Jedi only made everything worse. And to use The Force Awakens as an example, if one were to ask most people what the most emotional moment in that movie was, most would easily say the death of Han Solo. But that's only because it's Han Solo. If it had been a character that the audience wasn't nearly as attached to, then it wouldn't hold anywhere near as much weight because the writing isn't up to snuff. And take the old man at the beginning, for example. Both Lando and Wedge were originally intended to be in his place, but both actors turned it down because they didn't want their characters dying the way he does. And one has to admit, had it been either of them instead, that scene would have probably stuck out a lot more in the audience's mind than it ultimately does, because they don't know who this guy is, and the narrative doesn't let them get emotionally attached to him before he's killed. But surprisingly enough, the scene between Kylo Ren and Han Solo actually works even beyond the characters that it involves. Because think about what's actually going on here. Assuming that it somehow really is Han Solo, the scene basically amounts to a troubled young man at quite possibly his lowest point, is totally conflicted, unfulfilled, and has no idea what to do next. And then his dead father, the one man he should be able to count on for anything, comes back from beyond the grave to help him out. Though this isn't just his father, but also the man he had looked right in the eye and stabbed through the heart when he offered to forgive him for everything. But at the crucial moment, when he needs his help the most, he doesn't hesitate to be there for him. As I just said, this isn't just about Han Solo appearing to save Ben Solo, but a father coming to help his son, and in the process not only allows the son to apologize for killing him, but for the father to forgive him for it. And again, when one puts the scene into that context, that Han Solo isn't just there for him, but actively forgiving him for murdering him, as well as Kylo Ren all but apologizing for doing it, makes the scene very effective because it actually builds on a previously established moment. And unlike almost everything else surrounding Kylo Ren's character, the fact that this is the scene where he turns away from the dark side for good is actually pretty convincing, because he just made peace with killing his father and has come to terms with who he wants to be, Ben Solo. Though what also helps the scene along tremendously is the great acting by both Harrison Ford and Adam Driver. Seriously, in my video where I compared the Star Wars prequels to the sequels, which you can also find a link in the description to, I singled out how most of the actors had pretty much given up by the time the Rise of Skywalker came around and were just going through the motions. But not Adam Driver. He gave his all to the last, even when he had barely anything to work with, and the few good moments he had, such as this one with Han Solo, only proves that. Though props must also be given to Ford, as he perfectly conveys a loving parent that holds absolutely no animosity towards the child that did something terrible to them and just wants to help, while still making it feel totally like Han Solo at the same time. To put it simply, this scene and the interaction between the characters in it feels real, where most others in the sequel trilogy do not. Like, for example, pretty much every scene between Rey and Luke feels like a desperate attempt to artificially prop her character through him. Leia and Poe's dynamic in The Last Jedi ends up in shambles due to the nonsensical Holdo subplot. Han Solo feels as if he's just being used to fill the old mentor role to Rey and Finn without getting to be his own character. And even in the conversation between Yoda and Luke, Yoda ends up feeling simply like a mouthpiece for what Rian Johnson wants to say. In other words, very few character interactions in the sequel trilogy feel organic. The veil between the characters and the writer's intentions with them are completely non-existent, and is likely to take the viewer right out of the story because none of it feels natural. But this artificiality is nowhere to be found in the scene with Kylo Ren and Han Solo, which is kind of ironic, considering it was never intended to be part of the story at all, and was only put in due to Carrie Fisher's death. But nonetheless, and somewhat amazingly, it feels totally believable and in character for both of them, and there's no hidden intentions on the writer's part on display in that scene. It doesn't feel like Han Solo is being used to prop up Kylo Ren, but instead like a completely natural progression of the narrative and the setup to what his death in the earlier film had been leading up to. Now, all of this isn't to say that the scene is 100% perfect. As for one thing, the circumstances behind what exactly Kylo Ren's talking to can be a little confusing. And there's also the fact that he ends up coming back from the dark side of the Force way too easily. Because I dedicated a whole other video to discussing, which you can also find a link in the description to, that's not how the dark side of the Force works. Once it's got a hold on you, it's almost impossible to come back from. Just look at how far Luke had to take things to get Anakin to come back, and he had way more reason to turn away from the dark side than Kylo Ren did. And even apart from that, why exactly he does turn away from the dark side isn't explained that well either, though he had always been portrayed as very conflicted, so the point is probably meant to be that he's finally made up his mind. But in the end, these minor flaws aren't enough to take away from the fact that the scene itself is very effective at getting its point across and is likely to actually make the audience feel something. Unlike almost any other moment in the entire sequel trilogy, it actually has emotions to offer them besides just anger or an adrenaline rush. Now, as I noted before, obviously this is a somewhat subjective topic and many are likely to disagree with this assessment, and if you do, that's totally fine. Especially because in terms of sheer spectacle or action, there are indeed much better scenes in the sequel trilogy than this. However, the best moments in Star Wars are pretty well known for usually not being the ones to focus on the grand and epic side of things, but rather the more intimate and emotional moments. That's probably why The Empire Strikes Back is considered by many to be the best Star Wars movie, because it ironically contains the least amount of the battles that Star Wars is known for, and leans a lot more into the deeper, more philosophical, and of course emotional side of things. And one can't argue with the results. And similarly, any scene in subsequent films to focus more on such moments do indeed usually end up being among the most well-regarded in them. Now, some may argue that the sequel trilogy does have its fair share of such moments, but even if they do, the one between Kylo Ren and Han Solo is easily the best among them for all the reasons I just went over. And as I noted before, there's nothing artificial or contrived about it, but instead has its roots not only in something that was previously set up, but also executes it flawlessly, leaning heavily into Han Solo's forgiveness as well as Ben's regret for killing him, to the point that the scene has quite a bit of melancholy running through it, with the knowledge that he regrets killing him, but even with his forgiveness, there's nothing he can do about it now. As I already said, it's actually apt to make the viewer feel something deeper than the superficial action that the movie had previously offered, and that's what makes it such a great moment in an otherwise mediocre film. It doesn't try to impress, but instead does what's best for the story and characters, and in the process ends up doing way more than any of the sequel's more blatant or failed attempts at pleasing the viewer. Alright, I think I've made my point here. So now why don't you give me your opinions? Do you believe that the conversation between Kylo Ren and the memory of Han Solo in The Rise of Skywalker may just be the best scene in the entire sequel trilogy? Or do you believe that distinction belongs elsewhere? And what do you think of the scene itself? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because as I repeatedly stressed throughout the video, you don't have to agree with anything that was said here that you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.